Hi, everybody. Welcome to the information session for Cohort 2 of our Spatial Futures Fellows. Um, my name is Tina Grandinetti. I'm an associate here on the housing team. I'm based in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Hi,
Rashida.
everybody. My name is Rashida Phillips. I am Director of Housing at PolicyLink, and I'm based in Los Angeles.
Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Next slide. We suggest keeping your view on speaker. We also have closed captioning enabled, so you can turn it on through your Zoom interface, that button right up on the screen. And we are having a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, but you are welcome to use the Q&A box throughout the presentation to drop your questions in, and we'll be addressing them through that chat. We are also recording the presentation, and the slides will, along with the recording, will be shared with all the registrants after the webinar. So if you have to hop off or you want to refer back to what we talked about today, that'll all be made available. And our agenda for today, we're going to do a quick overview of the Spatial Futures Initiative. And then go into the specifics about the Spatial Futures Fellowship Program. We'll talk about deliverables, resources, and commitments. And then we'll go over a quick review of the application portal before having about 15 minutes left for questions and clarifications. So we can get started with an overview of our Spatial Futures Initiative.
All right, so I'm going to hop in and welcome again, everybody. Thanks so much for coming and coming to learn more about the Spatial Futures Initiative and the fellowship. And basically, the Spatial Futures Initiative is asking this bold sort of overarching question around what would our futures look like if space were oriented towards justice? And as we know, housing and land exclusion are racialized in nature. It's woven into the very fabric of our institutions, our policies, and our value systems. And in order to transform that reality, we have to address the historical and persistent spatial injustices and reveal the entrenched racial inequities that our country's existing land use and housing policies have embedded within them. And so land and housing in the United States has been defined by what are called racial regimes of property. And that's a concept that essentially underscores how property laws and how practices around property have been, and land and housing, quite frankly, have been systematically used to disenfranchise marginalized communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so that traditional ownership model of property, right, is essentially built on the power to exclude. It creates barriers that prevent equitable access to land and housing for everybody. And so property not only shapes physical spaces, right, but it also influences our identities and our social relations. And so reimagining our relationship with land, with housing, with space, with time, it really requires being able to embrace frameworks that are rooted in reparative spatial justice and radical liberatory justice. And so how we're thinking about and how we define reparative spatial justice in this project, next slide, please. For us, reparative spatial justice within the Spatial Futures Initiative is attempting to address and rectify the historical and ongoing inequities in how space and resources are distributed. So particularly, again, in marginalized Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so being able to prioritize communities and how they are thinking about repair, how they are thinking about the tools and the things that are needed in order to correct the social and spatial injustices that they're dealing with requires three different things that we think about. So aspirational world building, the solutions have to be transformative rather than reformist. And they also have to be community-driven, community-centered, and place-based. And so the Spatial Futures Initiative has several goals in terms of activating reparative spatial justice. One of those goals is sort of illuminating the systemic inequities that we see in policy architecture, right? So exposing those entrenched racial inequities that exist and that are built into our housing, land use, and economic domains. The second goal is thinking about how we transform that architecture, particularly through policy recommendations. So developing things like detailed suites of policy recommendations that are rooted in frameworks like reckoning, repairing, and transforming. Being able to advance reparative land and housing policies and framing them as the cornerstone of a broader vision where housing is seen as a human right and universal guarantee and not a privilege or commodity. And again, where communities are allowed to or given the space to reimagine their relationships to land and housing. We also want to amplify the reparative spatial justice work that is happening around the country. We want to be able to support the wins in housing and land justice by helping folks to be able to test and scale groundbreaking organizing, policy, legal, and narrative strategies. And then we're also forging narrative strategies. You can go back to the last slide, sorry. We're also supporting and forging narrative strategies as well. So we're crafting and implementing this sort of narratives that help to reframe and propel national discourse on reparative spatial justice, and then thereby altering sort of the intellectual, legal, ethical framework that shapes land and housing access and discourse. And so the Spatial Futures Initiative includes a bunch of different tools. Part of what we're doing is producing different publications, tools, resources. Our first publication in the project was the Grounding Justice publication that we premiered in January. And just this past summer, we did a translation in Spanish of the executive summary for this document. And this is basically just setting the ground for the need for reparative frameworks in land and housing policy, right? It's defining what these frameworks are, looking at examples of where this is happening around the country, right? Because in some ways, although it feels visionary, it's not just visionary, right? Like reparative spatial justice is happening, you know, whether it's housing reparations in Illinois, whether it's land back happening in California or in Hawaii, right? This work is already happening. And so we want to both amplify and continue building the tools and resources that the movement needs in order to advance this work. To that end, we also have built out a website, the spatialfutures.org site, which is a database of reparative spatial justice programs and policies that are, again, happening around the country. There's some additional resources, articles, readings, webinars, other tools that are there. So you can visit spatialfutures.org. We just premiered that a couple weeks ago. And so feel free to poke around on there. And if you see any other resources or things that you would like us to add or to make sure that we include on the site, please let us know. So I'm going to kick it back to Tina to talk about the other resource that we're producing through the Spatial Futures Initiative, which is the Spatial Futures Fellowship.
Yeah, so we know the fellowship is the reason you all are here, and this will be the second cohort. It's building on conversations from cohort 1, next slide, which brought together 10 fellows from across the country who are advancing reparative spatial justice in their communities. We're in our 10th month together, and we really focused on creating a learning community together where we could dig into questions that are impacting all of the fellows and their work. And some of the sort of like recurring themes and questions that have come up are how can we structure our relationships to land and housing around care and stewardship while still navigating our current system and protecting our claim to space and community? So that's just to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of foundational themes and conflicts that have come up in our conversations in really productive and generative ways. And in cohort 2, next, we hope to build on those by providing support and resources to fellows in their efforts to reclaim and repair land that's been stolen, polluted, or otherwise damaged by systems of oppression. We want to use this space as a place to explore models of land stewardship that draw on the knowledge and practices of Black and Indigenous communities. We, like Rashida mentioned, we really want to think about how our relationships to land and property can center care as opposed to exclusion. And then, of course, we hope to elevate reparative spatial justice in policy conversations, both at the very local and place-based level, all the way to larger national policy conversations. We want all of our fellows to contribute to the development of model policies, case studies, and campaign pathways that reflect these principles of repair, and then use that to build a body of knowledge and practice around reparative spatial justice that we can share with other communities who are trying to do similar work. Because we know all of this work is happening and we want to be kind of a connector for people and a resource. Next. So for cohort 2, we have 2 main deliverables. The first big one is that fellows will be working together to create a policy and strategy framework for reparative spatial justice. And we want this to be, we'll publish this at the end of the fellowship and hope that it'll influence policymaking at this local, state, and federal levels. And then throughout the fellowship, we will ask fellows to contribute to the growth of our digital platform so that it can be kind of a living and evolving place where we can disseminate policy models and best practices and share resources for leaders in their communities. Over the course of this 18-month fellowship, we are going to spend the first 6 months really focusing on relationship building and developing a shared understanding of what reparative spatial justice means, what are the historical inequities that we're working with and against. And then in months 7 through 13, we're going to be kind of working on developing out the framework, our methodology, the kinds of topics we want to address. And then months 14 to 18 will be focused on really honing in on that framework, polishing it, and then creating a plan for dissemination so that it can really have an impact. Next. As a fellow, you will receive the following resources. We're going to provide a $15,000 stipend, which can be paid either to you as an individual or to your organization. The only real eligibility requirement is that you must have a social security number and be based in the United States. Fellows are also going to receive mentorship and thought partnership from a team of expert advisors in our advisory committee. In cohort 1, our advisors played a really important role in kind of shaping the conversation and helping to guide our thinking around reparative spatial justice. And then, of course, fellows will be part of a learning community of peers that are working on similar issues and can hopefully provide, real camaraderie and company in what can be really hard and sometimes isolating work. And then in return, fellows will be asked to commit to the following. You'll be expected to commit up to 10 hours per month for this fellowship, and that includes 2 monthly meetings. So we'll have a 2-hour monthly cohort learning session where we'll dig into readings together, really build like a shared research base. And then after that, we'll have 1-hour monthly working meetings. And that's where that co-working and collaboration will happen for the actual drafting of the policy framework. Then that'll also include an additional 4 to 6 hours of required reading or independent research and writing. We'll have an in-person convening in April 2025. All of the expenses will be covered by PolicyLink, and that'll be a place for us to meet in person, develop relationships, and get into some of those, conversations that really happen best when we share space together. And then the final commitment is that you'll contribute to the publication of the reparative spatial justice policy framework and the digital platform. Next slide. So who should apply? We encourage all of you to apply. We are specifically looking for folks who are working in their communities to reckon with, repair, and transform the legacies of racist land and housing policies. So that means you should be working, approaching housing policy through both a racial and spatial justice lens. We are looking for folks who are working in policy or at the intersections of policy change to advance reparative spatial justice. And what we mean by that is that we see policy as part of a broader ecosystem. So you don't have to be a policy wonk, but we hope that you are involved in advancing policy change in some way, whether that's through community engagement, research, the arts, but that you can really make a strong case for that connection. We also are asking folks to either demonstrate the support of their broader institution or a community organization that can support your full participation in the fellowship. That's because we know that it's demanding. We have, at least 3 hours of meeting time during the working month. And we want to make sure that you have the support of your employer and that the resources of the fellowship can be shared with a broader organization. However, if you're an individual, we still invite you to apply so long as you can demonstrate that the capacity to participate fully in the program. And then finally, and most importantly, we're looking for fellows who are committed to building intersectionality and cross-movement solidarity to advance reparative spatial justice. Next. So some important dates for you to keep in mind. October 18th is the deadline to apply. And then from December 2nd to 6th, we will have an interview period for finalists. So in the weeks leading up to that, please keep an eye out in your emails for an invitation to book an interview if you've made it to the final round. On December 19th, final decisions will be announced via email. And then in February 2025, the cohort will begin and run from February till August 2026, so a full 18 months. I think that's about it. Next slide. Oh, Rashida, I'll hand this one off to you.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly do an overview of the application and encourage folks to continue popping questions in there. We'll have time for questions after this slide. But the application is fairly straightforward. I think the most important questions on there that we've highlighted is the question around, one, what does reparative spatial justice in land and or housing mean to you? Just want to emphasize that we're not looking for any particular answer. There's no right or wrong there, right? We, again, based on what we've been talking about, we understand that reparative justice happens in a variety of different contexts, from a variety of different perspectives, different strategies, very much based on the community that you're situated in or that you're working in. So we just really want to hear about, again, what does it look like to you? How is it showing up for you? And then the second question is sort of a multi-part question, but we're asking you to explain how your work addresses racial inequities and spatial injustices in land and housing. And I just want to emphasize there, right, like we're asking about how your work writ broadly, like whether it's the work within your organization, the work that you're doing in your community is working towards repair. And just want to clarify, like, we're not saying that the burden is on you to create that repair, right? But it's asking what your work is, what are the harms that your work is working towards repairing on. But these are the sort of nuanced conversations also that we'll be having throughout the fellowship. And the other question to point out there is that it does ask about solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities. One of the things that we are thinking through, and that has come up in lots of different ways in the cohort, in cohort 1, is this question around what does it mean to be doing this work? What does it mean to be advancing housing and land justice on Indigenous land? What do these questions of stewardship versus ownership versus caretaking look like? So these are all questions that we want to continue to build on through this fellowship, and knowing that, right, we're not going to have answers to these questions necessarily, but being intentional about how we're thinking about it in a policy framework that, again, is being built on land where there's ongoing injustices happening, ongoing theft and and exclusion happening. How do we grapple with these sorts of things through new kinds of models and new types of ways of stewarding, caretaking, ownership, whatever that may be. So we do ask about your experience and sort of your willingness and openness towards engaging in what are very deep, complex conversations across communities. So that's important for us to know, what the comfort level is there. And then finally, the other thing to point out is that when you submit the application, you're not going to get a separate email confirmation. You will get that message that's showing up there. But if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to the housing email that will pop into to the chat, and then we can confirm if we've received your application if you have any questions. All right, I think that is it for this slide, and we go into Q&A.
So we have some questions coming in through the Q&A box. I also just want to uplift what Nina has been sharing in the chat, that you can read through our Spatial Futures Fellowship frequently asked questions on our website, and you can also review the website where there's a lot more detail about the fellowship itself and the application process. But for now, we can work through some of the questions coming through. And a reminder again that all of that the presentation recording and slides will be shared.
Okay, so I think we have enough time where we can maybe just start at the top. The first question: if accepted into the fellowship, would it be possible to forego the stipend due to ethics rules at job? Yes, absolutely. We could definitely work through where if the stipend is received and who gets it, and if that's something that's not possible, that won't harm your chances or opportunities in terms of the application process. I love this question. Are Policy Link employees eligible to apply? That one's above my pay grade, so I will have to check in, and I'll get back to folks on that question.
The next one after that is, in the event we have a job change during the fellowship, how would you handle it? We have dealt with this in our current fellowship. We know that life happens, and so we are okay with change so long as there is continuity with reparative spatial justice work. The next part of their chat was that they might have a new job opportunity in the next 18 months, but still related to community ownership. And we definitely support your work as fellows broadly. The key thing is that we want you to be able to demonstrate that you sort of have support to participate fully, and that your commitment to reparative spatial justice is rich enough that the resources of the fellowship, the knowledge that you generate, will kind of percolate into the work that you're doing in your community.
Yeah, the next question is work related to housing, specifically an eligibility requirement for the fellowship. My work, for example, is primarily focused on agricultural land access and tenure use. Absolutely not a requirement. We are thinking about spatial justice writ large. As you said, there's overlap between housing and land justice and land stewardship and food justice and all of those things. And so we do want to bring in those intersectional considerations as much as possible. So we'll definitely encourage you to apply, even if you're not doing housing specific, what you think of as housing specific work. Those intersections are extremely important to the cohort and to thinking through what a policy framework should look like. So.
That's specifically why we kind of use the framework of spatial justice to make space, to make room for those connections. So thank you for that question.
In terms of what qualifies as an organization, yes. again, we are being pretty expansive in terms of how we're thinking about organization and having organizational backing. The emphasis is really just on making sure that folks have support to be able to fully participate in the fellowship. And we know that often when folks are working alone or in a single capacity or don't have sort of that larger resource, that it becomes a real challenge for them to be able to participate fully throughout the time span. So feel free to apply. Don't let that discourage you in terms of having the organizational backing, as long as you can just sort of give us some type of explanation or clarity around how you'll be able to meet the fellowship commitments. The next question is in regards to location. Is there going to be local work taking place first? And then will there be times where the fellows meet up and connect nationally? So this is a great question because our first cohort, our current cohort is very much focused on local work. And the cohort is geared towards supporting, towards the fellowship supporting local specific projects. This cohort will be much different. So this cohort will be focused nationally. We do fully expect that fellows will be doing their whatever their local work is at simultaneously. So when you come together as part of the cohort, the focus will sort of be focused on the framework, and the framework we're hoping will be sort of expansive enough to think through like sort of local, state, and national considerations in terms of policy, because again, we know that the policy around reparative spatial justice looks different depending on where you are, depending on what level you're speaking at in terms of national, state, federal. So we're hoping that the policy framework will accommodate all of those different sort of aspects of it. But the fellowship itself is not meant to really support or resource directly your local work. But again, we're hoping that what you learn through the fellowship, what we're learning together will support what you're doing locally. So Tina, anything to add to that?
No, that I think you covered that question. There's a really good one in the chat. Some folks in this space are strongly pursuing decommodification of land and housing, and others are pursuing more equitable pathways to that ownership. Is this program designed only for those who are pursuing commodification? That's a great question, and no, it is not. We are open to folks using multiple strategies. And that tension that you highlighted in that question is one of the key ideas that we're looking to dig into together. So we want folks on both sides of that tension. We understand that decommodification is really important, and we also understand that communities who have been excluded from ownership are now being. We understand that communities that have been excluded may still want to pursue ownership as a way to build wealth. And at the same time, we're looking to kind of disrupt what our definitions of wealth mean and how we can expand that understanding. So short answer, this program is designed for folks who are pursuing both strategies of decommodification and equitable ownership. And we're really interested in diving deeper into that conflict and tension.
Thanks. And yeah, I want to, I think this question was from the same person, so I want to follow up on it. But the question was asked about your purpose for the program seems to be focused on repair, but most of the questions ask about our experience with the harm. Will the strongest applications be the ones who explain the problem the best, or the ones that have the best plan for repair? That's a great question. I neither, honestly. I really feel like we're not asking folks to apply with a plan for repair. Repair and the strategies that are related to repair are very complex. And again, they're very contextual. They're in many ways can be about sort of the local landscape. You know, it intermingles with what's happening on the federal landscape around fair housing, around equal protections, all those sorts of things. And so I think the journey together is to figure out what are the strategies for repair, what are the ones that are best fit, that can be best articulated, that can be best part of a larger narrative that support sort of the approaches that we're thinking about how to remedy the harm. So again, how are we thinking about strategies and approaches that can support a transition from property ownership that excludes and harms to regimes that are more around land stewardship or caretaking, right? And so we don't quite have the answers, and we don't expect you all to have the answers to that. I think how we're reviewing the applications, and I'll kick it to Tina to talk a little bit more about the review process, but it's pretty holistic, and there are several different levels of review, and there's several different things that we take into consideration for the applicants. And so that question is not weighted more than other questions, but I'll kick it to Tina to give a very brief overview of our lengthy review process.
Okay, so our review is being conducted in several rounds. The first is sort of basic eligibility, that you've completed the application in its entirety and answered all of the questions substantively. Then we are screening for alignment with PolicyLink's mission and our housing team's program areas, and really looking to see that your application addresses land and or spatial justice through a racial equity lens. I think that that's sort of the key part, and it relates to other questions that are being asked in the chat about like folks who are asking if water equity, climate justice, and food justice all count as spatial justice. Really, we are asking you to make the case that it does in your application. Keeping in mind that this fellowship is led by our housing team, and that we have a specific focus on the racist legacies of housing policy, but we are really open to making deeper connections, and we've structured our application in a way that we think gives you space to make your best case for your application and to draw those connections for us. So we invite you to apply, whether you're if you work specifically in the food space, in the climate space, but that you are really intentional about answering those questions in a way that make that clear to us.
Yeah, and just to add on, even though for the fellowship is being run by the housing team, PolicyLink writ large, right, is a resource for the fellowship as well. So our infrastructure equity work, our water equity work will all be sort of resources and connections that will be made throughout the fellowship as well. I will answer this question. Other than the new Cohort 2 deliverables, can you share how the fellowship is changing from its first year? Was there feedback from year one fellows about what was most rewarding or challenging from the fellowship experience? Yeah, that's a great question. Because the fellowship is still in progress, there has not yet been a structured set of feedback from our fellows, but we have been paying attention as we go along, and we collect feedback every time we meet with them. And so some of the fellowship requirements are shifting as a result of some of the feedback that we've gotten and just some of the experiences. And part of it is also yeah, just a capacity issue, as well as thinking about how we are able to support local projects versus something that is more of a shared or collective of product and project as well. So that's part of what has guided some of our decisions around shifting the structure of the fellowship. Anything to add there, Tina?
Just that the key shift was one away from the development of individual projects and more towards the focus on like shared work around a policy framework. And I think the key thing there is that the fellowship is less direct skill building for the work that you're doing, and more like, how can we build a collective body of knowledge that can help us each in our own fields. And so one example of that is, for example, lots of communities are looking towards how can I create housing policy that addresses the harms of, say, redlining or urban renewal and highway expansion. And they're looking for, like, they're doing independent research and kind of, or sometimes trying to reinvent the wheel, where we want to bring in or create a body of knowledge where folks can turn to and say, this is what multiple communities have done. These are the strategies that have worked in Evanston or in Santa Monica. And it can be kind of a central place and a catalyst for that kind of work. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question a little.
Let's see. Trying to jump to some maybe we haven't answered already. Someone asks, can you say a little more about the goal to support fellows who are reclaiming and repairing land harmed by past spatial and racial injustice and how that shapes who should apply? Sorry, the questions are shifting around. To be specific, my work is around evictions and displacement. I wanted to make sure I understand if that would be an amazing fit. Yes, definitely work around evictions, and that's a lot of what my background is in as well. Prior to Policy Link, I was a eviction and mortgage defense, foreclosure defense attorney in Philadelphia, and thinking about how to apply both not just the racial equity lens, but a larger lens around reparative spatial justice is a really interesting way to think about this work. There are frameworks out there that will sort of be thinking through in the fellowship around like abolition, around transformative justice, those sorts of things. And in particular, one of the things that we're working on at Policy Link is around like eviction records themselves and how those prevent primarily Black and Brown folks from being able to access housing, and how we can think about, again, not just a fair housing lens, but a sort of transformative justice lens and abolitionist lens towards the housing system as a whole to sort of dismantle how eviction records harm folks. So yes, that is a great example of a way to sort of connect the strategies in the fellowship to work that you're doing.
I see one question: is regional representation considered for fellowship selection? Yes, it is. That's sort of at the final round of application review. Our review team sits down and takes a look at to make sure that we have a diverse cohort that addresses and is rooted in multiple communities. So our current cohort spans from Hawaii to Jackson, Mississippi. And we think that that's really beneficial to the conversations that we have, and that'll definitely be a key factor in our final cohort selection.
I saw a question in the chat earlier about where folks are at in their career and if it makes sense for later career folks or more emergent or maybe or mid-career folks. I would say apply whatever point you're at in your career. I think our first cohort is pretty intergenerational. We have folks who are youth folks just entering their careers on up to folks who are well into their careers and would consider themselves later term. So that intergenerational nature is extremely important to us. So we encourage folks to apply. I think the thing that I would point out is, to what extent you feel comfortable doing cohort-based work, doing work together in a cohort, working on a shared project. I know that might be cringe for some folks to think back to like group projects back in college or high school, but so I think the comfort level around like being a part of a fellowship, building relationships with that fellowship, and then doing work together is going to be the thing to think about in terms of like where you are in your career or your comfort level in terms of being a fellow, because right, there are other fellowships where, again, it might be more focused on a particular project or might be less involved in terms of building relationships, but that is a key piece and part of how the fellowship is structured. So I would think about that. There will be up to 10 fellows selected. And it does not come with any type of certification. There are fellowships out there that do have that, but ours does not. But you can put it on your resume. And I think it will look good. Someone asked, can you clarify what organizational backing means? I'm a volunteer with 2 organizations. Would I need a letter from them? That is fine to apply if you're volunteering with the organization. For selective fellows, we will be asking them to certify in some way that they do have that organizational backing. It may not necessarily be a letter. We can discuss like what makes sense or is most feasible for folks. But we do want some type of, just proof, not proof, right? But some type of evidence or commitment showing that you have that backing and support.
And I think so what's interesting about that question is it sounds like your spatial justice work happens in your volunteer capacity. And so we would be interested in seeing that those organizations that you volunteer with are kind of invested in your participation in the fellowship. But the other key piece is that our cohort meetings, which amount to about 3 hours a month, they happen during working hours. So it's really important for us to know that you are going to be able to attend that consistently, that you won't be missing sessions for work, and because we know that that's a significant time commitment. So that's another thing to consider there.
Someone asked, how can folks working in many communities navigate the application process? I think just name that. I think there's a question about like what communities you're accountable to. Feel free to name as many communities as you feel accountable to. Again, the application itself, our process for review is pretty holistic in the ways that Tina talked about. And so we won't be weighting it any particular way. If you like name, I'm accountable to 10 communities, that's fine. Just, share with us what that means and looks like for you. But if you have more questions about what that means, please feel free to reach out and we can try to give you some more guidance there. So I think we got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Did you see any that we should make sure we get to? Will the fellowship offer any opportunities for capacity building for housing justice, housing provider organizations? Asking as the ED of Just Homes, which is a newer organization based in Oakland. So I would say yes, but not directly. Again, the cohort will be pretty diverse, and it won't necessarily be focused specifically on housing itself. Like that will be one of the elements, right? But we'll be thinking about land justice and other forms of spatial justice as well. But definitely encourage you to apply. And even if not through the fellowship specifically, right, Policy Link more broadly does offer some of those opportunities and capacity building supports. So feel free to reach out to us if you have more specific questions about what that means or what that could look like for you.
Yeah, what we've tried to do in our current cohort is we assess folks' needs, knowing that we're not able to always provide for them, but it's pointing them in the direction of places where they might be able to find that support. Sometimes that has looked like consulting hours with our narrative coach, and other times it's like pointing them in the directions of other organizations that might be able to help them or provide thought partnership.
All right, so I see we are at time. No worries though, we will collect all these questions and make sure that we update the facts. And if there are specific questions that we did not answer and that you feel like you still need some insight on, please feel free to reach out to us. Don't hesitate, and one of us will get back to you soon and try to provide as thorough of a response as possible. But encourage you all to keep looking back at those facts. Every time that we get a question, we try to update it and keep it current. So feel free to look at that. The recording will be sent out afterwards, and then I'll kick it back to Tina to close us out.
Just final thing is that when you exit out of the webinar, you'll get a post-webinar survey, and that's one last chance to type in a question for us to address in our frequently asked questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to read all of your applications, and we hope this is helpful. Thanks so much.